In this video, we'll go over how I built this basic outfeed and assembly table. Stay tuned. I started the initial design in SketchUp. The design was based around using dimensional lumber from the box store. The frame is made from southern yellow pine and fir boards, with the top utilizing some spare 4x8 sheets of 1/2-inch plywood I had from a prior project. The top would be surfaced with a sheet of Formica for easy cleanup and surface durability. I started by breaking down some 2x6s to the width I needed for the table legs. Started out with rough lengths, and I would be cutting to final size later. The board was then ran through the joiner, starting by surfacing one of the faces, then using that face to reference on the fence to get my 90-degree reference edge. I then ran the board through the planer with the surface face down to get the top face nice and parallel to the surfaced face. Using the table saw, I ripped the board to width with my reference edge against the table saw fence. You'll note by how the boards keep dropping to the floor why I'm in need of an outfeed table. I then further refined the overall lengths of the board to my desired needs. One thing of note, on my mobile miter stand that I'm using, I made the mistake of not ensuring the board was fully against the stop block. You can see where it stopped at the support bar instead. Unfortunately, I made the mistake twice. You can see I do so again after flipping this board. Just something to be aware of when making cuts. Double check where your wood is before making the cut. After the legs were cut to length, I started glue up. Here I'm using my handy ketchup bottle dispenser. I am using a small brush to spread the glue on the boards. For future builds, I ended up getting a roller to help expedite this process. I am doing multiple glue ups here to save on clamp usage. Apply glue to just the faces needed for each individual leg. Then push each set of glue ups together before clamping. While that one was in clamps, I started on the eye-shaped frame portions of the table, one on each end and one in the middle of the table. Here I'm marking the center of the boards to utilize my domino joiner for the build. I know this is an expensive option, however I have it and I will be making use of it. This can also be accomplished by other joinery methods such as dowels, pocket holes, half-lap joints, traditional mortise and tenon, etc. Glue up follows next. I potentially could have used 2 dominoes instead of 1 I did on this joint. Might have made the alignment of this board easier and helped strengthen the joint some, but for the stress it'll be under, I think this will be fine. After the legs were out of clamps, I ran them through the joiner to remove dried glue and finalize the dimensions of the legs. Then I trimmed up the ends of the legs to clean up the dry glue and get the final length. I didn't notice the piece of wood get stuck in the miter saw, but did clear it later, and luckily it didn't mess with my cuts any. The scrap piece here came in handy for testing domino placement later on. Here I'm marking the placement of dominoes to join the I-frames to the table legs. I mark on each leg where the upper part of the leg was to not get mixed up when cutting, as I need to have more space at the bottom of each leg for the spacing above the floor and for the bottom shelf height. For this joint, I'm using the larger domino joiner to make the cuts to allow for the bigger, longer dominoes I'm using to join the legs in the frame. Again, Dowels or other joinery methods can be used here. At this point, I'm marking the center of the legs to add the adjustable feet. I'm utilizing a drill guide to make sure my drilling is kept straight. The adjustable feet will allow for me to make sure I can fine-tune the height of the outfeed table to my table saw. I'm using a piece of tape on the drill bit to make sure I keep the right depth. I'm using a self-centering drill bit to get the screw hole placement correct. Then test out the fit. Seems to work. I then got back to gluing the I-frames to the table legs. Applying glue to the dominoes and to the end of the boards. You can see the adjustable feet here on the legs. Get it all together, then clamp it up. Do this to both pairs of legs. Here I'm gluing up the center legs. I cut the pieces so that I didn't have to remove the material where the table stretchers would be resting. I used a cutoff from the stretcher to draw some reference lines before I start the glue up. And then I clamped it up with the clamps I had available. I used the domino again to add the holes required to connect the stretchers to the table legs, using the large dominoes again for this joint, but I did go with 2 dominoes for this joint. I then added the domino holes to the stretchers, or is it rails? I sometimes get the terminology mixed up. And here I performed a dry fit of the table base. Everything looks good. I put in the adjustable feet on the middle legs as well. Similar process as the last time. This time I thought to clamp up the legs to make it easier on myself. Next, I used the Craig pocket hole jig to add pocket holes to the top 2 table stretchers. These will be used later to hold the tabletop to the table. At this point, I'm adding dominoes to the middle I-frame of the table. I'm ready to get it added at this point. Here I'm adding reference lines to the middle of the stretcher. I need to place the domino in the center of the board for the middle I-frame. I'm using 2 lines with a 10mm offset as this is the distance needed for the board I will be using to reference the domino faceplate against and get the placement of the domino hole correct. I will also add a center line to reference. This all ensures I get the domino right in the center where I want it. And here I am trying to do the trick where you glue a piece of plywood to your board to use as a clamp point if you don't have clamps long enough for your project. For those more experienced than I was at this point, you might know what's going to happen. I used some CA glue and accelerator to attach the piece of plywood to the board. You can see on the frame where I have the temporary clamp points and where I already had the center I-frame attached, glued, and clamped up. I get the dominoes glued up and inserted, then glue up the ends of the boards, assemble, beat with the hammer if needed, and then clamp up. And here's where I learned why this doesn't work on pine so well. Normally you knock the board off and it might leave a little layer of plywood you can sand off. Well, in this case it rips out chunks of pine. So Be warned, this can happen on softer woods. Next is adding the center legs. I applied plenty of glue and decided to use some screws from the inside to assemble so I can move on and not have to wait for the glue to dry. The screws won't be seen. You can also note the pocket holes I added to attach the tabletop. Using the track saw, I ripped the plywood I'm using for the end caps. Then I used the track on my MFT table to cross-cut the plywood to final size. I clamped those to the table, added countersinks, and screwed in. This was set up so it would fit nice and flush with the table legs. I then used some pocket screws to add a center support for the table bottom on both halves of the table. This is set down a ½ inch to allow for the plywood to rest on top and be flush with the bottom rails. Using scraps from the plywood, I then added support around the edge where the table bottom would rest. They were tacked in place and then screws added. I then used the table saw to rip and cut down the plywood for the table bottom. I get the plywood in place and a little shift to get it squared up. I drew a line down the center where the supports were, then screwed that into place. I then tacked the plywood around the edges. And there's the table. Still needs a tabletop, but the base is done. Looking pretty good. Here are the 3 sheets of plywood I'm using for the top. I decided to not glue together in case I wanted to replace the top at some point. The plywood might be used on other projects. I just screwed the 3 sheets together. And here I'm trying to fit under the table to use the pocket holes that attach the tabletop. Not terribly comfortable for a guy my size. And there it is with the top attached. I then used the table saw to trim up the top and make sure it was the size and squared up. Then was the fun part, applying the contact cement for attaching the formica. The fumes are strong and nauseous, so be sure to have plenty of ventilation when applying this stuff. I also do not recommend using a brush. Use a roller, it would have been so much easier. Then when attaching the formica, I used wood scraps to keep it off the top so I could attach the top in small steps and roll with the J-roller as I go to ensure a strong bond and as bubble free as possible. After that was finished, I used the trim router with a flush trim bit to flush up the formica edge to be even with the tabletop. Be careful after you cut the formica, it can have a very sharp edge at this point. That's why I took this next step and used a 45-degree bit to add chamfer to the edge of the table. I like the look and it prevents cuts on that sharp edge. Lastly, I used the hand sander to try and smooth the plywood edges and clean up the edge a little. This is the final product for now. It gives me basic outfeed and assembly table function at this point, along with some storage that is needed. There are still more features that will need to be added, such as extending the miter slots from the table saw to the table so sleds can be used. Add some shelves and possibly drawers. But this will get me going for now, and other changes can be added when I figure out the final position I like with the table and the table saw. If you've made it this far, I hope you enjoyed my inaugural video from our workshop. I hope to continue adding videos of my projects in the future, improving my skill set, designs, and videos. The video format may change as I experiment, but hopefully of value to those watching. Thank you for watching.